I work at a restaurant. Same customer came in 3 days in a row. He had long, greasy hair, sunken eyes, and a patchy beard. He wore stained gray sweatpants and a ratty t-shirt that celebrated Expo 86. He stood in line in front of me and ordered a small black coffee. $1.50 is your total? He fished around in his neon pink fanny pack and passed me a handful of change. I felt the clammy coins touch my hand and I shuddered. He grinned at me, took his coffee, and found an empty table off in the corner. I leaned over to my coworker. "Have you seen that guy before? Gives me the creeps." She shrugged and went back to dipping churros in sugar. I helped the next customer, but I kept a watchful eye on the man in the corner. Maybe I was just being judgmental, but there was some indefinable quality about the man that made me uneasy. I noticed that he didn't touch his coffee. Too hot, I presumed. Despite not ordering food, I could see that he was doing this intense chewing motion with his jaw. I watched as he paused, stuck his fingers into his mouth, and extracted a revolting, masticated mass. Slick with saliva, it glistened in his hand. He then proceeded to stick this goop under the table. Gross, I thought, as he was just finishing his gum. Then I saw him reach into his fanny pack and insert a mystery gray morsel into his mouth. He began the process again, grinding it up, working it out of his mouth into his fingers, and depositing it under the table. I left the front counter and spoke with my supervisor. We have a policy about approaching customers who exhibit questionable behavior. Apparently, studies show that members of the public are more responsive to well-dressed management types than us uniformed peasants. I told him about this creep and his gross habit. My supervisor shrugged and said, "Whatever. He'll be gone soon. Just clean up after." I waited and I watched the man repeat this obscene ritual. He left after an hour. My supervisor reminded me that I should clean the table, top and bottom, before the next customer complained. I brought out the bucket of cleaning supplies and begrudgingly walked over to his table. I went down onto my hands and knees and looked up. I had to retreat to avoid vomiting. There were over 24 moist bundles of chewed-up goo that speckled the entire underside of the table. I took out our chisel and managed to wedge them all off into a waiting garbage bag. After the first piece plopped into the bag, something struck me as strange. This wasn't gum. In fact, I had no idea what it was. I've scraped off plenty of gum, and its appearance and shape is overall pretty consistent. Gum looks like old caulking and comes in all the colors of the rainbow. In contrast, the mystery gunk was dull gray and had the fibrous texture of chewed-up steak. The next day, at the start of my shift, I saw the man again. He was at a different table, and in front of him was another small coffee. Standing behind the till, I scrutinized the man's actions. Again, without fail, he stuck his fingers into his mouth, extracted a gnawed-on mass, and placed it under the table. I swore under my breath. Store policy be damned, I was going to speak to this gentleman and tell him his behavior was unacceptable. I asked my coworker to cover my till. I approached his table and saw his eyes light up as I drew nearer. He spoke first.
"Would you like some jerky?"
"Excuse me?" He reached into his fanny pack and removed a strip of meat. He held it up and waited, expectantly. No thank you, sir. We actually have a pretty strict policy on no outside food or drink."
"Really? That's a shame. More for me, then."
He opened his mouth and I saw that he was missing all his teeth. He placed the jerky into his mouth and I could hear his saliva churn as he gummed the meat and swished it with his tongue. "Sir, I need to speak to you about the stuff you're placing underneath the table."
"Oh, I am so sorry. I did not realize it was a bother. I will stop immediately."
"Okay," I said, feeling more than a little embarrassed and grossed out. I began to back off from the table when he grabbed my wrist and said,
"I like you."
I pulled back my arm and shuddered. I left the table, gave my hands a thorough cleaning, and went back to work. I didn't trust the man to keep his word, and sure enough, he continued depositing bits of food under the table. I saw him leave, and my supervisor encouraged me to go clean up. The table was worse than yesterday. It was like a star map of chewed-up food. I grabbed the chisel and again removed the disgusting meat stalactites from the table. The next day, I'm returning from my break when I see the man again. He's at a different table and has a small cup of coffee in front of him. I resolve that there is no way in hell I'm going to allow this to happen again. I approach my supervisor, and this time I am vehement. I threaten to walk out if he allows the man to continue this horrendous practice unopposed. My supervisor relents, says we can kick the man out as long as I'm the one that does it. He opts to remain in the back room while I do the confronting. I begin my approach, determined to put an end to this nonsense. I notice that beside the man, he has numerous grocery bags filled with economy-sized containers of salt. He sees me.
Sure you don't want some jerky?
No, sir. I spoke to you yesterday about the chewed-up meat you keep putting under the table. I asked you to stop, and you did not. I'm going to have to ask you to leave.
Are you alone?
What? No. Sir, please leave. If you don't leave now, I'm going to call the police. He frowned, but did not get up. He pulled out a wad of jerky from his fanny pack and placed it in his mouth. Then something fell out of his fanny pack and dropped to the table. It looked like a large French fry, but at the tip there was the unmistakable impression of a fingernail. There was no doubt in my mind that before me was a desiccated human index finger. My jaw dropped and I met his surprised gaze.
Such a shame. You would have dried up so nicely.
I ran before he could grab me. I barricaded myself in the back room and phoned the police. My supervisor hassled me for answers as I hyperventilated, trying to regain control. The police came shortly after. The man had left by that point, but given my description, they were able to pick him up soon after. Over the next few days, the police asked me many questions, and they provided few answers. A few months later, I got the whole story. Turns out he was a forward-thinking, long-term cannibal. He wanted to find the best way to preserve his kills, some technique that retained flavor without making the meat too tough. So he innovated. He bought an industrial-sized dehydrator, chopped up his victims, and filled Ziploc bags full of people gum. The media referred to him as the jerky killer based upon his love of spicing and drying his victims. Since he didn't have any teeth, he could never finish the last mouthful of fascia and muscle. Once the last bits of meat lost its flavor, it had to go somewhere. Under the table seemed like a reasonable place. Investigators found that he had placed pieces of his victims beneath the tables in over 100 restaurants. Apparently, one of his favorite activities was relaxing with a cup of black coffee and chewing the fat of his old friends.